Good evening, and thank you very much for coming this evening to the International Joint Commission's Town Hall meeting. This is an opportunity to hear from people on subjects of interest to them in the Great Lakes, but most particularly on Lake Erie, which we are focusing this evening. We've had 6 prior meetings around the Lake Erie in both Canada and the United States, listening to people. They've been very productive. We've learned a great deal, and we're happy to be here tonight in Cleveland as part of Great Lakes Week as well. So we're also being streamed live on greatlakesnow.org, and I'd like to, before I introduce folks, just say that when you speak, and you'll get more instructions, you'll get plenty of instructions, but it'll be a chance for you to speak, and you'll be asked to fill out a card from some of the staff who will make themselves known at that. First of all, though, let me welcome my colleagues. Let me welcome Rich Moy. Commissioner Moy is from Montana, and a fine colleague who spent much of a lifetime in Western water issues. And I point out that the IJC, under the Boundary Waters Treaty, which established us, has responsibility for all of the waters that the United States and Canada share, not just the Great Lakes. And next, Commissioner Lyle Knott from Vancouver, British Columbia, has seniority on the commission now, indeed. And on my left, Dareth Glantz from Syracuse, New York. Commissioner Glantz will actually be in charge when it's time for you to speak, so smile nicely at her, and she might let you speak a little longer. So we're going to be very, very brief. Let me just give you the lay of the land tonight. First, Commissioner Moy is going to give a very brief overview of our work that's ongoing with Lake Erie. I'll just say that we the Commission decided to really be very disciplined and focused, and to pick 3 issues of major concern, which we really wanted to make great progress in the triennial the cycle that is a part of the new Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. And one of those issues is Lake Erie, and particularly the nutrient loadings that are related to the algal blooms. Second, after Commissioner Moy speaks, we're fortunate and we're lucky, we're going to be hearing from both the US EPA. Cameron Davis is a special advisor to the US EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson, and Mike Goffin is the Ontario Regional Director General for Environment Canada. Both of these gentlemen were very involved in negotiating the new the revised Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. And they're going to briefly give some remarks on how that revised agreement can be helpful as we address the issues that we're all concerned about with Lake Erie and beyond. They'll also be here as resource individuals. When you ask your questions, they may be better prepared to answer some of those questions, and they're willing to be here for that purpose, so we thank them for that. And then we'll turn to you and look forward to receiving your questions on these issues. So with that, I think we'll start with Commissioner Moy.
Well, thank you, Lana. So I'm going to spend about 5 minutes talking about the Lake Erie priority that we have. And as you can see, this is one of 3 priorities that we have. And the Lake Erie priority, we'll go into detail and discuss that. But I also want to identify the other 2 priorities for you. We have a priority on what's called assessment of programs to restoring the Great Lakes. And it's really 5 key objectives that we're trying to accomplish. We want to know what are the keystone or the apex indicators of physical, chemical, and biological health of the Great Lakes. We want to define those. And we also want to define what are the health indicators. And we're going to take those sets of indicators, and then we're going to say The third objective is look at the monitoring program. Do we have a good monitoring program in place for those indicators? Because we want to look at long-term trend analysis for those indicators so we have a way to actually provide guidance to governments to make sure that we're meeting the requirements in the revised water quality agreement. One other priority that we have under this objective, this goal, is to assess the framework that we have of all the government programs out there so that we know what we can do as far as moving those programs forward and working with governments. The last priority goal that we have is we want to strengthen the capacity to deliver the science about Great Lakes to citizens and throughout the Great Lakes system. One of the things we know is that there's some great databases out there that have been built by the NOAA, by the USGS, by the Water Resource Survey of Canada, by Environment Canada. We want to make sure that those databases are accessible for everyone on the Great Lakes. So let's talk about the Great Lakes ecosystem priority. What we want to have, and this is pretty, we want to have measurable reductions in dissolved reactive phosphorus in 3 years. Measurable. And we're pretty optimistic, and maybe too optimistic, but we know that we need to start reducing loads into into Lake Erie regarding dissolved reactive phosphorus. And to do that, we need to understand the science. I think we know most of the science out there, but we need to put the science together in a framework that people can understand. We also want to make sure that we have the appropriate monitoring system in place to actually measure how successful we become in actually trying to address algal blooms in Lake Erie. And then we want to be able to build coastal resilience. We want to help the governments build a better governance structure to address in an effective manner non-point sources of pollution into the Great Lakes and some point sources regarding phosphorus. And then we want to bring the community along. We want to make sure that the communities around the Great Lakes understand, around Lake Erie understand what we're trying to accomplish and that they're with us in doing this. And you can see in this next slide is a 2010 picture of Lake Erie. And it's interesting
Yeah, hit it once more.
Oops. 2010 picture of Lake Erie. And you can see here, this was 2010. 2011 was many, many, many times worse than 2010. Okay, so I went through the goals. So the next thing I want to do is show you, this is another picture of Pelee Island. And you can see here, it looks like art. But this is the effect of algal blooms in 2011. And one of the ways that we're doing this is that we have developed a very, very good comprehensive task force working with us. And we have some of the best scientists from the governments from both Canada and the United States and from the provinces and from the states and from academia from both sides of the border to address this issue of Lake Erie. And we have defined 2 co-chairs, and we have Dave Carpenter at the University of Alabama from the U.S. side, and we have Sue Watson from Environment Canada from the Canadian side. Okay, one of the things we want to do is, and we're in this process now, is we want to put together 5 papers and summarize in what we understand as the science of what's happening regarding algal blooms on Lake Erie. And so the first one is to understand what are the internal and external loadings that are caused of total phosphorus and dissolved reactive phosphorus on Lake Erie. The second one we want to do is that we know that climate change, intensity of storms, and increased temperatures is having an effect on algal blooms in the lake. So we want to try to have a better understanding of the effects of climate on those algal blooms. The third thing is we want to have a review paper on the effectiveness of agriculture and urban best management practices in reducing total and dissolved reactive phosphorus loads. How well are they working today? What do we need to do differently to improve them? And then we want to look at the monitoring program across the entire Lake Erie. We want to make sure that we're measuring loads of dissolved reactive phosphorus and total phosphorus in Canada and the United States, and we're looking at also measuring concentrations within the lake. And then we want to have a review paper on the key indicators to nutrient loading, such as dissolved oxygen, such as chlorophyll primary production. The other thing we want to do is we want to look at the social and economic ramifications. We want to understand what are the economic impacts of an excessive algal bloom in Lake Erie. What are the costs? Then we want to know what are the costs and benefits of solutions, and we want to understand what are the barriers out there to barriers and incentives for voluntary actions to improve and to reduce dissolved reactive phosphorus. And then we want to have another paper that looks at the legislative and regulatory framework. What type of framework do we have out there? How well is, for example, a TMDL program working to improve water quality in the States? Is there a comparable program in Canada? What can we do as an IJC to help working with governments to try to figure out a better mechanism to make sure that we are actually reducing dissolved reactive phosphorus? I was told and heard today by Jeff Reuter that we need to reduce dissolved reactive phosphorus by 2/3 in order to control algal blooms on Lake Erie. And the last thing we want to do, we want an assessment report on the possible recommendations of for social economic solutions. So we have a very stringent timeline, and this is a 3-year timeline. So we're putting together these 8 papers, 5 on the science, 3 on the social economics. We want to have this done by December of this year. We want to then take these papers and put together a workshop sometime in February, where we bring together all the top scientists from Canada, the United States, and academia to review these papers and help us put together a final interim report, and that we would hope to have together by May of 2013. And then we want to go out and seek public consultation from May through July on this report. And our intent is to try to finalize it in fall of 2013. This is the first year of this 3-year program, and what we want to do then is we want to spend the next 2 years after that figuring out a way, working with governments to implement our recommendations in the report in order to actually reduce dissolved reactive phosphorus and loads into Lake Erie. What we have done so far is we're holding 8 meetings around the Great Lakes. This is the 7th. And so far we've had comments from over 200 people, and we really appreciate, and we want to hear from you on comments that you might have tonight. And with that, I thank you, and I want to turn it over to Mike Goffin.
Thank you. Thanks, Rick.
Okay.
Well, thank you. I've been asked to speak a little bit about Canadian action on Lake Erie addressing the recurrence of toxic and nuisance algae problem in that lake. But this is the first chance that I've had to speak on Great Lakes since last Friday, when Minister Kent from Canada and Administrator Jackson from the United States signed the new Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. So I did want to take just a minute and as Commissioner Pollock noted, remark on that new agreement, and also to take the opportunity to thank Cam Davis for his part in the negotiation of that agreement, because I truly believe that without Cam's participation and that of Susan Hedman, Regional Administrator for EPA Region 5, who'll be joining us tomorrow, we really wouldn't have achieved a new agreement. And so thank you, Cam, for your part in the process. The new agreement does address phosphorus. There's a consolidated annex within the new agreement. It brings forward the targets that were set in the past, and it commits to establishing new targets for the Great Lakes. For the first time, establishing targets for the nearshore waters as well as open waters, and for establishing targets for Lake Erie within 3 years of entry into force of the agreement. And then within 5 years of entry into force, establishing strategies for achieving those targets on both sides of the border. I think most people in this room and elsewhere know that algae was a major driver of the original agreement signed in 1972. At that time, environmentalists held mock funerals, coffins full of water, declaring the Great Lakes were dead because of the algae problem and phosphorus enrichment. And we successfully met the challenge and reduced phosphorus concentrations through massive investment in sewage treatment, through significant changes to land use management, and through product regulations to reduce phosphorus content. And we had that problem under control. And unfortunately, regrettably, due to changing conditions within the lakes, the algae problem has returned. And in many respects, the algae problem is more complex in the current iteration than it was in the past. So factors such as climate change and invasive species are contributing, we believe, to that algae problem. Some of the best management practices that we put into place in the 70s are no longer doing the job that's needed. Some of those best management practices may actually be adding to the problem, contributing to the adverse effects of phosphorus loadings to the Great Lakes. So there's a lot of work to be done to understand the problem and a lot of work to be done to address the problem. On Lake Erie, the Government of Canada has increased its efforts to understand and address the algae issue, believing that by focusing on Lake Erie first, where the problem is most pronounced, we'll develop the science and policy approaches that will lead to successful solutions for the other Great Lakes. We have a 4-part initiative that was launched this year and will continue for the next 4 years. Part 1 is measuring and reporting on phosphorus concentrations in Lake Erie and loads entering Lake Erie from major Canadian tributaries. This will provide updated and improved understanding of Canadian phosphorus loadings to the lake and critical data for input to forecasting models to derive phosphorus load reduction targets. In addition, it will allow us to identify the future monitoring and information needs to inform policy decision-making and to track progress. Part 2 is modeling and research. This is needed to better understand the factors contributing to the reoccurrence of large-scale outbreaks of toxic and nuisance algae. It'll result in an improved and shared understanding of the factors contributing to toxic and nuisance algae production in nearshore waters as well as open waters. Part 3 of our program is establishing binationally agreed upon science-based phosphorus concentration objectives and phosphorus load reduction targets. So maybe just take a second and explain that the way that the new agreement addresses phosphorus is it suggests that we should start with lake ecosystem objectives. What type of an ecosystem do we want in Lake Erie? What are the characteristics of that ecosystem? The second stage is what concentrations of phosphorus will lead us into that type of ecosystem as it pertains to toxic and nuisance algae. Once we know the concentrations that we want in open waters and nearshore waters, the next question is, what are the loads entering the lake of phosphorus that will result in those concentrations? And then finally, what are the load reduction targets, apportioned between each country, that are necessary in order to achieve those loads? So it's a very stepwise process. It leads to very specific targets for both countries to work towards, and then leaves the method by which each country will achieve those targets up to each country. And that's always been a hallmark of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement and one of the key factors leading to its success. Because our two countries have many similarities, but we have many differences in the way we approach environmental issues and the policy tools we choose to employ to get there. So part 4, finally, of the Canadian initiative is assessing and developing those policy options and strategies for reducing phosphorus loads from urban and agricultural point and non-point sources. We'll explore options for achieving Canadian phosphorus load reduction targets, including use and effectiveness of current and new best management practices for phosphorus control, as well as other federal, provincial, and municipal policies and programs to control phosphorus loadings. Together, we believe that these 4 steps, 4 parts to our program, will contribute to implementing pollution prevention and control measures for the reduction of phosphorus, and also lead to the achievement of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement objectives as they pertain to phosphorus. They'll also contribute to our understanding of the issue and be transferable to other lakes. So with that very quick summary of the Canadian initiative, it's now my pleasure to turn the microphone over to Cam Davis, Special Advisor to the Administrator on Great Lakes issues.
Thank you very much, Mr. Goffin. And now,
Great. Well, thank you, everybody. First of all, thanks to all of you in the audience. I was joking around with a colleague of mine today that I used to be with a non-governmental organization and zing the questions at government officials. And I believe in karma, so now it's payback time. So I'm looking forward to it tonight. Thanks to the commissioners as well for putting on the show. It's a wonderful opportunity for us to have an exchange of ideas and to try to answer some questions. Mike, right back at you, was a wonderful negotiating partner through the agreement negotiation process, as was Tracy Newell, who's here with the Department of State. I also want to thank Pete Cassell and Scott Ireland, who are here from EPA. Mike mentioned there's going to be a presentation on progress by Environment Canada and EPA on Wednesday morning. Please do go to that if you can. I'm also told that I should remind folks in the audience that you can tweet questions to hashtag Great Lakes Week for those of you who are listening and watching from far and wide. But let's go ahead and dive right on into the discussion. First of all, we're gonna talk a lot about Lake Erie, or I am, but before I do that, I want to mention that one of the tools in our toolbox here in the United States is with something called the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative that President Obama put on the map with proposed funding that actually went through starting for our fiscal year 10 with the U.S. government. And without that, I think we would be stuck in neutral. It's been a real godsend to be able to punch the accelerator with the resources that come along with the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. And fortunately, I think we're on track with progress in more than 50%. A majority of the work that we're doing under the GLRI, we're on track to meet our objectives, things we call measures of progress under our 5-year Great Lakes Restoration Initiative action plan. You get a little bit of a sense of where we're meeting targets, where we have a little ways to go. But since it's a brand new program, we're only midway through the program. The fact that we're now achieving more than 50% of our measures is a very good sign. And now's our chance to talk a little bit about some of the other things related to the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. Mike mentioned first the Water Quality Agreement, so I won't cover those. But one of the things that we've done federally, which I think will help contribute to work under the agreement, is prioritized areas, what we call priority watersheds, all around the Great Lakes. These are the places that are in desperate trouble when it comes to things like harmful algae, the kinds of things that choke the life out of our waterways, the kinds of things that hit our local coastal economies so hard, whether it's folks who come and want to fish, people who want to go to the beach, all of those things. We've prioritized 3 areas, 3 pockets around the Great Lakes that deserve special attention. One of them, and you see this in Lake Michigan, is the Green Bay Fox River area of concern. Another one, number 2, is the Saginaw River and Saginaw Bay area. I said area of concern with Green Bay Fox River. That's a toxics issue. The second one, Saginaw River and Bay. And then the third one is the Maumee River and Maumee Bay that flow into the western basin of Lake Erie. And it's because of some of this work that we are now harmonizing this effort with what some of our obligations are under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. Picture of Minister Kent and Administrator Jackson signing that agreement last Friday. Can't tell you how excited I am to have that done, and we'll move on to implementation. But the key part here is, you heard from Mike just a little bit before, that the 2 countries have now obligated themselves to set targets for the reduction of nutrients, especially phosphorus, into Lake Erie. The thing that's really important to note here is that we are putting Lake Erie first. Of all of the lakes and all of the pockets around the lakes where we have to do work to cut nutrients, Lake Erie comes first with those targets that need to be developed within 3 years. I promised I'd keep it short. That's it. Thanks to the commissioners, and Dareth, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cam. Thank you very much, Mike, and that was a great overview, and we really appreciate you all taking the time to share that with folks tonight. I have quite a few cards already, so if you're interested in sharing your perspective with us, we have been focused on Lake Erie. We definitely want to hear your concerns with Lake Erie, but of the entirety of the Great Lakes Basin as well. So don't feel like you have to limit your concerns only to Lake Erie. We want to listen to anything about the Great Lakes that you want to share. And I'm going to call on you in the order in which I received the cards, so we have it fair. There is a microphone that's right there. Camille, can you stand up? Camille will be your eye guide for where the microphone is. Thank you very much. And we want to make sure that we can hear you because there's folks that may be listening to us across the internet. Again, if you have questions via Twitter, it's hashtag Great Lakes Week. If you want to visit it on Facebook, it's Great Lakes Week. And of course online at greatlakesweek.org. Everybody's going to have 3 minutes so we can keep it fair. We want to make sure that we hear from everybody. As moderator, I've got a nice, beautiful clock right there so I can keep you on track. You'll get a yellow card from Caitlin. That's what your yellow card looks like when you've got a minute left, and then the red card when you are overdue. So we really encourage you to wrap up that question so we can keep this thing moving and hear the answers and hear from as many people as possible today. The answers, I'm also going to be enforcing how long we give answers. So that's oftentimes that can soak up a lot of the time, as many of you know, and we want to hear from you. So the answer should really be no longer than 3 minutes and should be much shorter. And we can always take these conversations offline too, because many of them have very detailed answers. And I'd like to let you know that all of you are fair game to be called upon to answer a question. We have many familiar faces, and so don't be surprised if I ask you to answer the question. And are there still folks at the door? Yep. Excellent. If there's, and maybe many others will inspire you. And if you want to share your comments in writing with us and you don't have them today, you can always go to www.ijc.org and submit them via the web or email us at commission@windsor.ijc.org. There we go. I got that right. And we just ask everybody to be polite and courteous, as you always are in the Great Lakes Basin. And when you get up to speak, just state your name, and if you represent an organization, share that, as well as the community that you're from. It just helps us understand where you're coming from. And those are the rules, and we're ready to get started. So without further ado, I'm going to actually give the first 3 people so that we've reserved some seats down front. So if the following person, the persons can sit and you're ready to go so we can keep things going. So ready to speak first is going to be Amanda Keith. And following Amanda will be Patricia Marita and then Connie Klein. Now those were 3 relatively easy names. If I slaughter your name, please, I'm going to ask for your apologies to begin with. And Amanda.
Okay. Good evening. My name is Amanda Keith, and I reside at 540 South Water Street in Kent, Ohio. I am a conservation coordinator for the Ohio Chapter Sierra Club and a concerned individual who sees value in promoting citizen science across Ohio. Based on the Ohio EPA's 2012 Integrated Reports list of prioritized impaired waters, many rivers that feed into Lake Erie will not be included in the Ohio EPA's monitoring reports for 15 or more years. Large water bodies such as the Little Cuyahoga River and the Tinkers Creek watershed have not been monitored by the Ohio EPA since the late 1990s and will not be looked at again until 2020. Many smaller northern Ohio streams and tributaries that are impacted by local pollution and may be potentially contributing to Lake Erie's harmful algae blooms may never be remediated or monitored due to lacking OEPA funding and staff. The Ohio EPA's Credible Data Program is designed to classify surface water quality data performed by Ohio citizens. In order for citizens' data to be considered by the Ohio EPA and determined scientifically valid in a court of law, citizens must achieve at least level 2. However, the Ohio EPA currently does not have funding to train citizen scientists for levels 2 and 3, and these people are forced to pay for 2 years of college or university training and for their data to be taken seriously, and this training can easily cost thousands of dollars. Citizen scientists are everyday farmers who depend on clean water for their cattle and crops. Regular teachers who monitor to learn alongside their students what it means to be water conservationists. And they are concerned parents who worry about their family's health and want to take an active role in keeping their drinking water clean. As the International Joint Commission, an agency that believes in cooperation between countries, state agencies, and the public, I urge you to consider accepting water quality monitoring results that are consistently and reliably conducted by citizen scientists across the state of Ohio. Their commitment to understanding water quality and the data they have generated through working with local nonprofits, schools, water advocacy, and watershed groups are invaluable resources to you. I hope you will accept citizen science water quality results and consider them seriously in your decision making. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Commissioners, do you have any comments? Okay. Patricia Morita?
Hi, I'm Patricia Morita.
Thank you.
I'm the chair of the Ohio Sierra Club's Nuclear Issues Committee, and I want to speak tonight about the fastest to happen, most thoroughly and permanently deadly threat to our Great Lakes, which would be a nuclear accident. Now, the Great Lakes region is host to nearly 40 nuclear reactors, and some of these are in the decommissioning stage. They've all had ongoing accidents, emergencies, and radioactive spills, and they are all allowed legally to have routine radioactive releases. The IJC at one time had a nuclear task force studying radioactive threats to the Great Lakes, which ended a few years ago. The Sierra Club's understanding is that this happened because of wrong-headed arguments that nuclear power could somehow address global warming. So I'm handing in a paper about explaining why that's not the case. Vast amounts of fossil fuel energy are used throughout the nuclear fuel cycle, from mining, milling, conversion and deconversion, enrichment, formulation, building of facilities, transportation, not to mention the energy that will be consumed, isolating radioactive wastes essentially forever. So it's too expensive, it takes too long to build, and it's unnecessarily dangerous. But there is another threat looming now, the transportation of radioactive materials on the Great Lakes. Canada recently passed an omnibus budget bill making changes to the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, and that would end the need for an environmental assessment for many or most radioactive shipments on the lakes. And in the U.S., the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration is working to harmonize regulations for shipping of radioactive and hazardous materials with Canada. So harmonize in this case means water down, not strengthen U.S. law. And work is also afoot to harmonize these watered down regulations worldwide. Now there is a facility very close to here, to Cleveland, called New Green, advertising that they clean and refurbish radioactive equipment. This is located on Lake Erie next to the Perry nuclear plant. So if these laws I mentioned before are changed, it could attract shipments of radioactive materials from around the Great Lakes Basin, but also from around the world. So I'm submitting a flyer explaining this also. The changes in shipping laws could actually allow shipments of radioactive waste across the lakes. And we know that the Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Future has recommended interim storage, which could mean a mobile Chernobyl, could mean a lot of moving of wastes around, could be shipping wastes on the lakes. In addition, Ontario Power Generation is seeking approval from Canada to build a deep geological repository for low and intermediate radioactive waste right within 1 kilometer of Lake Huron. And not only that, but in this very same area, Canada is considering building a high-level waste dump. So the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in the U.S. is giving license extensions for 20 years to power plants 20 years beyond their engineered lifespans. and exposure to radioactivity causes cement and steel to become embrittled over time. Now, we understand that the IJC must be invited by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission in order for a nuclear task force to be reinstated. Both of these agencies have a history of accommodating the industry that they are charged with regulating, while at the same time making it difficult for organizations like the Sierra Club to have their voices and legal challenges heard. In the light of the toxicity of radioactivity and the threat of all these new developments, we urge the IJC to advocate reinstating the nuclear task force. And if the NRC and the CNSC are not in agreement, we urge the Commission to establish a committee charged with updating the 1997 Great Lakes radionuclide inventory and evaluating nuclear threats to the Great Lakes. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Connie Klein. And after Connie, I have Russell Bimber and Sandy Bin. And Patricia, if you have something that, did you hand it to John Nevin? Okay, thank you.
My name is Connie Klein. I live in Lake County, probably about 15 miles away from the Perry Nuclear Power Plant and the newly opened New Green Legacy Services that Pat mentioned. I'm going to be very brief because I don't think that I can improve on perfection, and I consider the information that Pat gave you perfect. I just would like to reemphasize the need to update the 1997 Great Lakes radionuclide inventory, and I think it's absolutely imperative, and I hope that the IJC will seriously consider reinstating the nuclear task force. You know, to eliminate the task force because of climate change or global warming and the necessity for nuclear power is really a misunderstanding of the situation. To process fuel rods for nuclear power plants requires a great deal of coal is what's usually used to in the processing, as Pat mentioned. You know, to draw a line of demarcation between nuclear power and other fuels is like saying, you know, do we want to kill ourselves by a heart attack or cancer? I mean, neither one of them are really acceptable. So I thank you for this opportunity. I hope that you will very seriously consider updating the nuclear inventory on the Great Lakes and certainly reinstating the nuclear task force. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Russell Bimber.
Thank you. I am Russell Bimber, a retired chemist who worked for Diamond Alkali, Diamond Shamrock, and successor companies for 40 years. I was a research chemist, and I am very concerned now about a hazardous chemical waste landfill my employer left on the edge of Lake Erie. It's in almost the worst possible location for a hazardous waste burial site. It contains about 3.5 million pounds of hazardous chemicals, most of them chlorinated solvents. It also includes chlorinated solids, which can easily be dissolved by those solids, carried into the water, and I believe it has been leaking to Lake Erie. I think this is documented in some references in the paper I've given you. The hazardous waste disposal site is represented by this red dot on the paper here, but it really should be much closer to the edge of the lake because they've had to pull back the fence around one corner, which is just 50 feet, used to be 50 feet out from the burials because it's on a 45-foot high bluff. The waste is buried about halfway down in the bluff, and it's in a severe erosion area as shown in a DVD I gave Commissioner Moy. I also gave him a flash drive with a copy of a 4-page paper I've prepared here, giving specific details. This is a very unusual site in that you have documentation from the company's top representatives to EPA about the burial of the huge quantities, such as 5 railroad tank cars full of a mixture of hexachlorobutadiene and hexachlorobenzene. This was not originally intended to end up there. The way it happened is we made that material as an unsaleable byproduct in Texas. All of a sudden, the Pennsylvania Salt Company wanted hexachlorobutadiene. They offered us 50 cents a pound for all we could provide. All of that waste was sent to our semi-works plant in Ashtabula, Ohio, to be redistilled to take out most of the hexachlorobenzene so we could sell it to them. But before we processed all that waste, they canceled the order. The material was sent to the nearest large diamond plant, and the plant manager was told to get rid of it. He did. It's buried right here. Now, I say this is almost the worst possible spot because this Fairport Beach, represented by the green area, off to the west, it runs about 1.25 miles to 1.75 miles west of the landfill. But with the Grand River flowing out through a narrow opening in the breakwalls to Lake Erie, this outer breakwall, which is 1/2 mile offshore, is beginning to subside because of some of Diamond Salt brining operations, I believe. But anyway, with the river flowing out there, it tends to draw water westward, past the landfill, past this beach, where you have mothers with young children, the most sensitive population. And if they're putting on a little suntan lotion, that oil will tend to accumulate and concentrate the chlorinated organic wastes in their suntan lotion. This stuff is known to be accumulated in body fat. It can tend to destroy vitamins A, D, E, and K, the fat-soluble vitamins. So many of the ill effects of chlorinated organics are those resulting from a deficiency of these fat-soluble vitamins. And next, going further west, we have Mentor Headlands Beach State Park. They have 18 large U-shaped parking lots, about 1/2 mile long with parking on both sides of the U. They typically get over 50,000 people on the hottest days of summer using that park. It's got a wonderful sandy beach because the eastward drift of sand along the south shore of the lake built up a marvelous big sandy beach there. It's a wonderful place. I lived in Paynesville for 48 years while I was working for Diamond, and I went there very often. I loved it. Now, other than the beaches, there's a park off to the east, which is primarily a fishing park because it's in a severe erosion area. Not having that sand drifting eastward, there's very severe erosion once you get beyond the end of this offshore breakwater, 1/2 mile out. Paynesville Township Park has spent a lot of money putting in iron pilings to try to stop. Okay, I see my time is up. I guess I have to leave you now.
Thank you very much, and we really appreciate you dropping the other information with us, and really appreciate that. Sandy Bin, and then following Sandy is Ann Caruso, followed by Wayne Howard. Right now I have Wayne Howard scheduled to be our final speaker. If you're interested in speaking, please sign up with John Nevin with one of the cards. Thank you very much. Sandy?
Thanks. My name is Sandy Ben, and I'm the Lake Erie Waterkeeper. Excuse me. And this evening, I want to thank the IJC for all the work that you've been doing and the meetings you've held and the public process that you've had. It's sincerely appreciated. This evening, I'd like to just give a history lesson in what was written between 1970 and 1982 called the Lake Erie Management and Assessment Report. And it talks about the Detroit River controlling circulation in the western basin of Lake Erie. And it says that total phosphorus is characterized by high concentrations near the mouth of the Maumee River in the western basin and the Cuyahoga River in the central basin. There's a general west-to-east decrease with the highest values located along the United States shore, particularly at the mouths of the major tributaries. The Detroit River is an exception in that a large volume of upper Great Lakes water tends to dilute the nutrient load contributed by the urban and industrial complexes adjacent to the river. Although low in concentrations when compared to the Maumee River, the Detroit River in 1980 contributed 37% of the phosphorus to Lake Erie, where the Maumee was 12% of the load. The Detroit River in 1970 was 67% of the load. It decreased, obviously, through the practices that were instituted. These loads were coming from documents from the IJC, NWRI, and the United States Army Corps of Engineers. There was a decrease in phosphorus loadings, but not a decrease in phosphorus concentrations. It's not been possible to translate the decline in phosphorus loadings to Lake Erie to the decreases in concentrations or quantities of the total phosphorus measured in the lake. Even when open lake data is filtered to remove the erratic fluctuations caused by spring and fall storms, no significant changes in total phosphorus can be seen from 1970 to 1982. And again, those are phosphorus concentrations. This can be explained partially by releases from sediment through the wave action. Several investigations have demonstrated that approximately 80% of the phosphorus loading to Lake Erie becomes incorporated into the bottom sediments. Next, total P published estimates vary considerably and are confusing in their data sets. Next, nitrogen is the only major dissolved constituent in the water of Lake Erie which has shown a dramatic increase in the past decade, and again, this is from 70 to 80. Increases of chemical fertilizers and gaseous emissions are thought to be the major causes. The numbers went from 63 to 65, 120 milligrams per liter of nitrogen, to 78 to 82 to 434 milligrams per liter. I just want to close this by saying that there's other variables, that the Detroit River and other things that need to be considered in the total puzzle. There needs to be cooperation between the United States and Canada. Would like to see a TMDL in the western and central basins of Lake Erie to pull all the data and the assessment together. Would also like a Great Lakes Nutrient Algae Task Force for monitoring. The monitoring in the Maumee River that's been done is 15 miles from the mouth of the river or the outfall of the river, and obviously a ways from Lake Erie. And the only other thing I'd like to share, the first algae bloom this year, by the way, in Lake Erie was in 2011 and 2012 was in Monroe, Michigan by the DTE outfall. And I don't know what that does to the overall algae production in the lake, but it's an interesting stat. And the last thing I want to share is that yesterday I got a call. I live next to Maumee Bay State Park, adjacent to it. A lady was walking her dog and she was appalled by the green water that she was seeing. Again, the green algae was back. And so I have a view. I went out and looked. It looked perfectly good from where I could see it from the window, but when I went out, it was washing in green water. This morning, I went back out to bring a sample here to show you this evening, and the water was perfectly clear. As I left today about noon, there was scum on the water and foam, and that's usually an indication that the algae is coming. I texted my husband to go down to the beach tonight, and the green water is washing in again very much. So just to show you the variability in the water, it's very substantial and very often and very frequent. It's a very big puzzle to be able to address. Sediments, nitrogen, the history of what was done before, please take it into consideration, and I wish you well in meeting your projection of, in 3 years, getting a lot done. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I have Ann Caruso.
My name is Ann Caruso. I live in Cleveland Heights, Ohio, and my comments are on behalf of the Northeast Ohio Sierra Club. The comments refer to unconventional hydraulic hydrofracking Unconventional hydraulic hydrofracking causes the removal from the rain cycle the 3 to 5 million gallons of water used for each frac. The water used for fracking is permanently out of the rain cycle due to the large quantity that remains underground as part of the fracking process and the remaining flowback, which is disposed of in injection wells in Ohio. Given that a well can be fracked about 10 to 12 times, this is a tremendous amount of water for the lifetime of just one well. Here are some figures that were given as part of the proponent testimony for Senate Bill 315 by the director of the ODNR last spring. Quote, by the end of 2015, approximately 2,250 horizontal wells will be drilled, end quote. And the industry has predicted that it will be drilling in Ohio for many decades. On June 4, 2012, Governor John Kasich signed into law House Bill 473, restricting the amount of water that can be withdrawn from Lake Erie to 2.5 million gallons per day, and all but, quote, high-quality streams and rivers to 1 million gallons per day without requiring a permit. This will encourage the withdrawal of just below the limits by multiple companies to meet the demands for the fracking wells. The removal of so much water over time could cause a devastating effect on the ability of a Great Lake to renew and cycle its water, causing changes in living conditions for the fish and other animals that live in the lake, as well as changes to the weather that the lake generates. Rivers and streams that flow directly into the Great Lakes will likely suffer large water withdrawals for fracking, with that water also being removed from the rain cycle. With the polar ice caps melting at record-breaking speeds, with much of the world running out of water sources, with climate change happening at an ever-increasing pace, with the current drought we're suffering from in the Midwest, these permanent water withdrawals from our water sources and the rain cycle will greatly affect the health of the animal and plant life within Lake Erie, the rivers and streams that feed it, and ultimately the health of us all as potable water becomes more and more scarce. Further damage to the lake's biology is also likely, as low flow in streams at spawning times and during the summer will cause declines in the numbers and viability of species using the streams to spawn, grow to maturity, and for food sources. The Northeast Ohio Sierra Club asks that the IJC do all in its power to require that all water withdrawn for fracking and that should be from the Great Lakes or their streams or rivers that feed into them require a permit. The limits for withdrawals should be set on a river and lake basis and not be independent for each company making withdrawals. This will enable the overall environmental impacts to be better known and controlled.
Thank you very much, Ms. Caruso. And next I have Wayne Howard. Oh, you're going to pass? Okay. Oh. And Joel Bremer is my final speaker that I have. So if anybody else is interested in speaking, let us know.
I just stepped up at the last minute, so if anybody else wants to, please do. I don't need to be the final one. First of all, I just wanted to, I'll be brief, congratulate the commissioners and the parties on a successful negotiation. It's great to see the agreement signed. And as everybody's been saying, move on to the next phase, of course, which is implementation, which Cam certainly mentioned in his comments tonight. My specific comment and possible question, it has to do with the phosphorus issue. Sorry, I'm perhaps slightly taller than the average speaker. So I spent a little bit of time with the commissioners and some academics recently talking about the idea of how do we understand how whether or not we're making progress on restoring the Great Lakes. What do we use to indicate progress? And one of the conversations that came up was something that Cam alluded to in his comments, which was this issue of targets for phosphorus. And tonight we're talking about Lake Erie, but it's relevant to the entire Great Lakes. What we realize is that the open water, or looking at the lake as a single system and saying, here's a number that if we reach it, we're all going to be okay, and the algae blooms are going to go away, that's not realistic. So we understand that. But what we're also hearing is that it is going to take 3 years to get to those targets and understand where we ought to be in the near shore, in the open water, and in all these different parts of the lake where phosphorus acts differently. Now, I understand and appreciate the need for academic certainty and rigor to come up with targets that are meaningful, but there's a balance that needs to be struck, because one of the things that's going to make implementation easier is if we actually have state level standards that allow us to use all the tools that we have at our disposal to try to reach the targets that are going to make Lake Erie and the other Great Lakes healthy. Right now, the gap of not having appropriate phosphorus standards at the state level inhibits our ability to implement some of the controls that are necessary and to create some innovative partnerships, like what we're starting to see develop in Wisconsin, where you do have a phosphorus standard in place that is enabling partnerships to develop between, for example, rural landowners and urban areas to get a handle on phosphorus control on a watershed basis. So I guess I'll just close with a comment and say that the sooner we can get to that right balance of scientifically credible targets and aggressive state level implementation of phosphorus standards that are written in the right way for how the basins differ across their spectrum, I think the further ahead we'll be. So I encourage the commission to, do its work as quickly as possible to get to those targets, and the parties to find ways to use those targets to implement standards in the most efficient and quickest way possible. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Do you have any comments?
I have a comment specific to what you said, that I believe the agreement says that they set the 3-year outside goal. There's nothing that says that targets couldn't be set earlier than that, and the IJC is planning on advising the governments. We don't have any authority to implement anything in this regard, but we are advisory. So I think we're all eager to move faster rather than slower. And one of the I think fine points in the revised agreement is that it warns against waiting for absolute certainty. There is no absolute certainty in any of this science. And the new agreement, the revised agreement, encourages all of us in the provincial governments, the federal governments, and certainly the IJC to not delay until there is certainty, because when we know the status quo is failing us, it's irresponsible to wait too long. So we at the IJC have spoken often in recent months about actionable science, which doesn't mean perfect knowledge.
Yeah, just to add on to what Lana just said, one of the things is we can set interim targets that are less than what we have now for loading and for in-lake concentrations, and achieve those interim targets, and then we realize we need to even go further, then we can lower those targets further. But it can be a progressive process. But right now we have no targets, and one of the key things we want to do with the Lake Erie priority is make sure that we can push governments to identify those targets as quickly as possible.
And I think you hit a very important piece that's in the water quality agreement, and so I don't know if Cam or Mike want to speak to the concept of we don't want the perfect to be the enemy of making real good progress.
I'll confess I only made it to about page 35 on the plane today. So
you got it on Friday. These guys brought it all the way here.
All of you are exactly right in terms of not waiting for perfect science. In fact, it's one of the reasons why you see in the agreement for the very first time, since it was signed for the first time in 1972, the notion of precaution, which is that we do need to take action in the face of uncertainty. We had that in there for a reason, and that is to acknowledge the very thought that the lakes are dynamic. And there is, like Chair Pollock says, there is no such thing as certain science. Thank you.
I'm going to thank you very much.
Thank you.
I believe our time has come. Thank you. People were pointing at me, and I was trying to figure out. There we go. Okay. Oh, Pete Cassell, who's actually in the back. Hi, Pete. How does the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement address climate change? That's an excellent question. There's an annex that's dedicated to addressing climate change, and perhaps Cam or Mike would like to get into the details.
Sure, I'll take a whack at it, and then Mike, feel free. But Commissioner Glantz, you just said it best. There is an entirely new annex in the revised agreement. An annex is an issue-specific set of provisions that deals with climate change. The general thrust of that new annex is to take information that we have and to basically scale it to help communities prepare for the effects of climate change, to make sure that we're making sure that those coastal communities in the Great Lakes themselves are as resilient as they can be in the face of the changes that are coming.
Please come to the microphone.
Sorry, Christy Meyer from the Ohio Environmental Council. Joel sparked a thought in my head. So the Lake Erie LAMP has identified some nutrient loading targets. And I heard you guys talk about how you don't have authority, and I recognize that you don't have authority to really require the states to meet those standards. And I guess for a couple of years, I've been trying to figure out how the International Joint Commission and the LAMPs are going to work with the states and the provinces to really ensure that we are meeting these targets. And I haven't really got a good answer. I haven't gotten any answer. So I'm wondering if you guys could give me an answer.
Okay. Chair Pollack would like to answer your question, Christy. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
You know, I've stated several times just since Friday that it's really the will of the people in two great democracies that will determine whether these lakes will be better protected or not at all protected, or will stumble along. We will advise, and hopefully we will do a good job not only in the science behind our advice, but we will also, I hope, do a good job working with any number of agencies, governments, provincial, state, watershed, as well as public and NGOs. And it's collectively how clear and how forceful we are that will determine whether governments who do have the authority to do this act. It's not going to be easy. But one thing that, and I speak for myself personally and perhaps for my colleagues, only perhaps, I'm very impatient when people say we can't afford to protect the lakes. We can't afford not to protect the lakes. Look at the hundreds of millions of dollars that we're spending to try and clean up the AOCs. And the AOCs, the areas of concern, which were designated 40 of them, I think, they're not even the whole story. So to say we cannot afford it is it's an ignorant statement. And the IJC is going to repeatedly offer good advice, but how well we are heard will depend very much on everybody in this audience and well beyond. I'm a recovering politician, and I know what moves politicians, and it's public pressure. So if the public understands and the public speaks out, the politicians, the electeds in both countries and at all levels will be responsive. If the public is indifferent or appears to be indifferent, or is confused and offers bad advice that can't be backed up, then the government, it's easy to ignore a lot of flailing around and bad advice that's not well based. It's harder to ignore well-founded science.
And also,
Mike has
go
a
ahead.
comment.
Yes, go ahead, Mike.
Sorry, I didn't mean to step on the applause there.
Right.
Just an excellent question. So I just wanted to give you an idea of what will be happening under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. So one of the important amendments that we've made is to expand the Great Lakes Executive Committee, which is traditionally made up of federal, state, and provincial agencies, and those agencies that have something to do with Great Lakes water quality, and they all come to the table and they devise action plans and coordinate actions. We've expanded that to include municipalities, tribes, First Nations, Métis, regional level agencies, all of the agencies that are needed to come together and take action. So we have all the action takers at the table. And what we've done with all of the annexes, but including the phosphorus annex, is to call for a subcommittee to be formed to develop a 3-year action plan. So what is it specifically governments are going to be doing to address the commitments in the agreement? And we'll be meeting in December to start the process of pulling that together. It's a huge coordination activity, 8 states, 1 province, 2 countries, all with different jurisdictions, each level of government having their roles to play. So we're pulling all of that together. I think the big thing, though, that I wanted to say is it's very important to understand that while we are doing science, while we're developing strategies, the action is not stopping. So there are massive investments in both countries in sewage treatment plant upgrades. It's a major source. In educational initiatives to teach homeowners that they don't need to put phosphate fertilizers on their lawns. Another piece that the science has brought to us, that urban runoff is a major source of phosphorus to the lakes. There are programs on both sides of the country to promote agricultural land management practices and to encourage farmers to adopt those and to assist them in adopting those, another major source of phosphorus. So those activities go on. Major policy initiatives on both sides of the border to provide the tools that will be needed to take action. And we'll be hearing more, or have heard today, and we'll be hearing more about Ontario's Great Lakes Protection Act that could give, on the Canadian side, a major policy lever for addressing priority areas within the Great Lakes as they pertain to phosphorus. So lots going on at the same time as we do the science and strategy. And so while I'm a big supporter of let's take action, I think we have to understand the magnitude of the action we're talking about. This isn't a little tweak. It isn't change a target and everything will fall into line. I think we have a sizable challenge when it comes to phosphorus. The solutions are going to have economic implications for municipalities, for landowners, for farmers. And before you take some of those decisions, you have to have a good level of certainty. So I think that's a quick summary of what we're up to.
Yep.
Yeah, I'd just like to add a comment. You know, 2011, the algal blooms was larger than the 4 previous largest algal blooms combined, and on Lake Erie. And so I think people are starting to become aware how significant the issue is. It's only going to get worse. Because I think now with commodity prices so high, you're going to see CRP land going out of production. And more of that, CRP is Conservation Reserve Program lands that are put into conservation. They're going to be put back into agricultural production, and that's only going to increase nutrient loading into the lakes. I also think that tile drainage is a problem. And I heard some of the solutions that was proposed by the state of Ohio today. But when you got 4.5 million acres in the Monty River alone that's in agricultural production, and you're only starting to take less than 1% of trying to cure the problem, you have an enormous problem out there. And 2 of our priorities, of our 3 priorities, are focused on long-term monitoring of key ecological parameters that we can say to governments, you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing under the clean water, under the revised Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, and we're going to put pressure on them. Because that's going to be our job under the agreement, is to make sure they meet their requirements under the agreement.
I really appreciate the adaptive approach that we've heard. I certainly think that being able to monitor and being able to do our TMDLs will help us pinpoint and focus really where the major causes are coming from. So we're not taking more of a scatter approach. And I appreciate that the US EPA has really focused in on some key areas in the Great Lakes under the Great Lakes Restoration Agreement. and appreciate that you guys are going around the Great Lakes and listening to people and their concerns. And congratulations as well. I'll echo Joel's comments on the signing of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Is anybody else inspired? Oh, excellent. Come on down.
Good evening. My name is Gary Wilson from Chicago, and I write for the Great Lakes Echo out of Michigan State University. And I was glad to hear Cam say he believed in karma this evening, so here's a little karma. The Echo reported this morning, writing about the signing of the agreement, where John Jackson from Great Lakes United and Dr. Gail Kranzenberg from Hamilton, Ontario, reported they were very frustrated with the 3 to 5 years, 3 years to assess and 5 years to implement changes related to phosphorus. And I'd like your comments on that, please.
Well, I already, if I might, I already mentioned that those are the outside parameters. And some things will be able to, I think, reasonably be accomplished much sooner, and some things may have a hard time being achieved in that time frame. But from the IGAC's perspective, on the issues that we're particularly focused on, we hope to make a contribution. We hope that contribution will be in, we know that contribution will be in collaboration with a number of experts who are here this week and organizations. We think we already have a lot of information and that some things can go more quickly.
And just to build off of that, I just want to reiterate, work has not stopped because the agreement was signed. That work is ongoing. What the agreement does is really provide a framework that allows us to move forward, that's more accessible to the public, based on common principles, that allows us to have more of a preventative approach. And as far as the Lake Erie priority, which we have about 6 months really underneath our belt, we're really hopeful that we'll be able to meet the, actually exceed those timelines, and that's just the floor, and we can always go faster, but it needs to be informed. Is that helpful, Gary?
Well, I've got a quick follow-up on that.
Okay.
And let me add to my echo that the time frames in there are outside, but also we need to rely on the authorities, Gary, not just that we have federally, but also the states, municipalities, and other jurisdictions as well. We haven't yet gotten those other authorities together. So once that happens, we'll be able to better harmonize efforts and use all the tools in the various toolbox to help us get there. But I can guarantee this, there is, we feel a whole lot of urgency on this particular issue.
I would just add that what I just reported were the words of Dr. Kranzberg and John Jackson, but I would contextualize them in that the agreement doesn't have a great track record for delivering. So therefore, I think the skepticism is justified. Thank you.
And just to follow up to that, I'd like to kind of reiterate what the message that Lana spoke to earlier is accountability and transparency are critical values and core principles in the agreement, but you are the people that breathe life into that. And so there is a relationship for the public to hold the agreement accountable, to hold the parties accountable, to hold the IJC accountable, to make sure that it fulfills the promise as we continue moving on. The conversation has not ended. It's only just continued and begun. I think from the improvements of the agreement that I've been able to see, that have been encapsulated in the version that's been renewed after 40 years, it really continues to rely on every single person that's engaged in these issues to keep the political urgency going so that programs continue to be funded, so that resources and staff continue to be allocated, and that this continues to rise to the top level of political actions so that the stewardship for the Great Lakes continues and gets stronger, and that we're able to enjoy the lakes that we love so dearly.
I would also challenge you on one point. It's not that the agreement hasn't had a good track record. It's had a mixed track record. it had an excellent track record at the beginning. I mean, Lake Erie was a great success story. And anybody who knew anything about worldwide about ecological success, turning around a lake that had been given up for dead. And that was driven by the agreement, but it's mixed. And certainly we've had disappointing results at various times, and no one is more disappointed than I, or more critical. But let's not forget our success, because on the basis of that historic success rests my real optimism and confidence that we can do it again. And you know what? Even when we succeed, the next generation will have to do it again and again and again. It's never finally fixed.
I hope in 3 to 5 years that we're seeing the results.
So do we.
Have you all gotten warmed up? Is there anybody else that's going to come down? So you've changed your mind, Wayne? You're joining us now? I look forward to your comments.
And I,
Go ahead.
and I apologize, I have not read the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement yet, so.
It's fresh.
It's been out for 48 hours.
I understand that. But the phrase that keeps going through my mind with the 3 to 5 years is the phrase paralysis by analysis. And I'm very fearful in many circumstances that will give an excuse to further delay action. I was involved in a TMDL for 2 watersheds in Lake Ontario with Black Creek and Oak Orchard Creek. And the TMDLs turned into something known as, that nobody knew before, called the WQRS, a Water Quality Review Standard, because we don't have standards for moving water. And there is a standard in New York State for 20 parts per million, but not for moving water. So we are not able to complete the TMDL, but we have everything up to a TMDL without the teeth. And looking at New York State once again, with a big push for Greek yogurt, there's talk of further relaxing CAFO standards. So I see on one hand the great news about the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, but I see what's happening on the ground, and I'm very concerned that this will be used as a further excuse to delay coming up with standards in the state. And I applaud your efforts, but I'm hoping we can find another way to make this step up the time frame, because the push, even Lake Ontario, where we have a larger water, deeper lake, I don't think we're far behind, as far behind Lake Erie as we think we might be.
Thank you, Wayne. Oh. Okay, thank you very much. Will IJC recommend states to have wastewater treatment plants report to the public the volume of combined sewer overflows into the Great Lakes?
We'll certainly take that under consideration. But as we will, I mean, these town hall meetings and the meetings that we've had particular to Lake Erie have really provided us with a number of new challenges, with new information, and we take it seriously. And this is an issue to be taken seriously, and thank you.
Going once. Is there anybody else in the audience? Twice. Well, I want to thank everybody for staying with us. This has been a great kickoff again for Great Lakes Week. Really appreciate the comments that you took the time to share with us today. Please stay in touch. We are accessible. You can always reach us at ijc.org, and we really look forward to working and hearing from you as you get a chance to go through that Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. If you have specific comments on implementation, we welcome your comments on that, as well as Lake Erie, as well as the other issues that you face in your neck of the Great Lakes. Are there some closing comments that my fellow commissioners would like to share? Okay.
My thanks to you and my thanks to my colleagues.
Thank you.
And to Cam and to Mike.
Yeah, and congratulations. Just to let everybody know, in 2009 on the Peace Bridge by Niagara Falls, the United States and Canada declared that they were going to renegotiate the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, and I think it's just a huge accomplishment that within 3 years they have done that. So just a round of applause for great good faith negotiations and results. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Derek.